Hi, welcome to Stressed Anyone? Tonight we're going to talk about adrenals and blood sugar issues. My name is Barbara Solomon. I'm a board certified nutrition specialist and certified functional medicine practitioner. Before we get started, I need to go over a disclaimer. I'm not a physician, and the following is for information only and not intended to be used to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any illness. This should not be considered medical advice and is not a substitute for care by your licensed medical doctor. So that being said, let's get started. The adrenal glands are actually two small glands that sit above the kidneys because ad means above and renal means kidney, so adrenals. There are two parts to the adrenals. There's the adrenal cortex on the outside, that's where we make our hormones from cholesterol, and there's the inside part, that's where we secrete our adrenaline to control our fight or flight response. Now, the adrenals are really busy. Their main job is to keep the body's reactions to stress in balance, and so that the body's reactions are appropriate and they're not harmful to you. So, for example, like cortisol is a protective anti-inflammatory and it's an antioxidant, and it helps minimize negative and allergic reactions from alcohol and drugs and foods, environmental allergens, cancers, infections, and autoimmune disorders. But it has other things it needs to do. It also closely modulates the utilization of carbohydrates and fats. It is involved in the conversion of fats and protein into energy. It is involved in distribution of stored fat, normalization of blood sugar. It helps with proper cardiovascular and gastrointestinal function. It balances minerals such as sodium and potassium. And after midlife and menopause for women, it becomes the major source of our sex hormones. So these things do a lot in the body. Now, there's lots of things that can affect the adrenal glands. It could be spiritual things, it could be emotional things, but it can also be physical things, as you can see from this picture right here. And anything that affects the adrenal glands will initiate a adrenal response. Now, the adrenals are designed to help us survive. In our ancestral days, right, we encountered something and we either fought it or we ran from it. And that's what the adrenals do. They start this process. So they shut down things that aren't so important, such as having sex and metabolizing your food. And instead, they turn on the things that are really important for survival. So they'll release a little bit of adrenaline to dilate the eyes. They'll go ahead and send sugar to the muscles. They'll oxygenate the lungs. And if you need to keep running and running and running, they'll release cortisol so that you can sustain this, you have energy to sustain this reaction so that you can get away from whatever it is that's attacking you. As we mentioned, stress can be spiritual, emotional, or physical. And you can see from this diagram from Dr. Gant, there is a total stress load. And what that means is that stress of one kind can initiate stress in another kind, and you can kind of really overwhelm the body. So we have things like spiritual and cognitive stress. There's energetic stress, oxidative stress, toxic stress, and so on and so forth. In the office, we're really concerned about things like metabolic stress and immune stress and toxic stress and endocrine stress and infectious stress, because we get oxidative stress. We can do things about those kinds of things. But again, it's really important to understand what your total stress load is. Issues with adrenals can really affect health throughout the body, and health throughout the body can really affect the adrenals. And one of these mechanisms is called by which this happens is called the pregnenolone steal. Now, I know this sounds technical, but let's break this down. The adrenal glands make some things. They make aldosterone that will help control the mineralocorticoids, and they'll secrete adrenaline and norepi in order to initiate some kind of immediate response that needs to be taken by the body. But they also use cholesterol to make some key things. They make cortisol that allows you to help with your immune system and brings down inflammation and to release stored energy if you need to. And they also use cholesterol to make your sex hormones. Now, if the body becomes dysregulated and the stress load becomes too much, these adrenal glands become compromised, and they really need to kind of do some type of triage. Because if there's only so much cholesterol to go around to make all of these things, and we really need to fight off an infection, or we really need to deal with the stress, the body is going to upregulate the manufacture of cortisol, and in doing so, it needs to downregulate the manufacture of these other things, such as your sex hormones. And so you can end up having lots of symptomology in the body because of the pregnenolone steal not allowing all the activities to normally occur. And that's why when someone becomes stressed, the normal way that this happens is you have problems with your adrenals and you find you have problems with your sex hormones and it affects your thyroid. That's the normal way that we start to see dysfunction. Another way that the adrenal glands affect health throughout the body is via the thyroid. And we know the thyroid touches everything. And there's another webinar on thyroid if you'd like to watch that. But the idea is this. if we're under stress and we have to make and utilize cortisol and we have to deal with the stress, it uses a lot of the body's natural resources. It uses a lot of vitamins. It uses a lot of minerals. It uses our amino acids. It uses stored sugar. It uses all kinds of things to meet the metabolic needs to keep you to survive. And because of that, what it'll do is it'll slow down the production of thyroid hormones. And additionally, it'll slow down the conversion of thyroid hormones into something the body can use. And by doing that, it puts on the brakes. Whoa, Nelly, we're going to just slow things down so that we don't burn ourselves out and we can save resources that might be needed in order to keep us to survive. Again, these are some pretty important mechanisms. And you can see, here's just an example of what can happen. If you have pain or infections or poor nutrition or some of these risk factors that eventually cause issues with your adrenal glands, you start to see things like blood sugar dysregulation and blood pressure problems and insomnia and hypothyroidism, poor digestion and immune function and constipation. And you go, well, why all these symptoms? And you can see why, because the body is constantly releasing sugar in order to meet these needs. So wouldn't you expect to gain weight? And if your body has more sugar than it can handle in the bloodstream, it gets stored as fat, and so you gain more weight. If you run out of sugar, you can strip your resources, your gut, your collagen, your muscles to make more sugar to deal with the stress. And not surprising, you have a low sex drive because you've shut down the manufacture of sex hormones. And with that, you would have mineral regulation problems, and that would affect your blood pressure. So you can see you can't break down your food if your digestion's on hold, if you're under stress. So all these varied symptoms make a lot of sense when you understand the physiology behind them. And the idea is this: stress was designed to be short term. Problem is we have daily stress now. We have things that aren't going away. We have job stress. We have environmental stresses. We have all of these things. And because of that, we're constantly relying on the adrenal glands to produce more and more cortisol to keep it going. And we end up with these kinds of symptoms that we're seeing here. What happens if we have too much stress? At first, the adrenals will start to adapt. They're just going to adjust things. Eventually, they get tired. And just like anything else, they can finally burn themselves out, just like this little guy here under the load from all the stress of life. And then they don't work so well anymore. And then you're wondering, man, I have no energy. I have no resilience. And if you work out, you feel 1,000 times worse because you just don't have the resources you need in order to meet the basic needs of your body. How do you tell where you're at? You need to do some testing. If you have a plethora of symptoms, you need to go to your healthcare provider and talk to them and consider looking for underlying causes, looking that might be affecting the adrenals, but more importantly, really doing some testing. And that's why I like starting off with functional blood testing. I always start off with functional blood testing because not only can I see some indications of the mineralocorticoids that the adrenals may be involved in, but I'm getting a big picture of health. And that's what you're looking for, all of these risk factors that might be affecting your adrenals. The other thing we can do if we really believe that it's adrenal based is we can go ahead and test them directly. And we do that with something called the Dutch urine test. And I like this test for two various reasons. First of all, cortisol is released in a normal daily rhythm. It's just like, your body is getting sugar from your food sources, therefore you wouldn't need to rely so much on your adrenal glands. When you're sleeping, you need to rely more on that. So there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, but basically there's a pattern, a normal pattern that they follow. And you can test that and go, yeah, am I secreting the right amount of cortisol in the morning? Am I secreting it in the early day? Am I secreting it in the afternoon? Am I secreting it at night? And then you know if your adrenal glands are working correctly. And the other part I like about this test is it not only says, well, are you secreting the cortisol, but are you able to actually utilize the cortisol that you're secreting? Because it's just not enough to make it if you can't use it. And that's why I love how comprehensive this particular test is. There's other ways you can test your adrenal glands. They do a blood draw in order to test your cortisol, but for me, I don't understand it because if somebody is going to be sticking me with a needle, I'm going to have an adrenal response anyway. That's frightening to me and quite painful. So, even if they're doing that, does that number that they're testing make a lot of sense? The other thing is there's a salivary test that can go ahead and tell you, yeah, is my rhythm right? Am I releasing cortisol at the proper amounts during the day? And that's a great test, but it doesn't tell you if the cortisol is being metabolized. But I utilize both of those tests in the office. In addition, there's some things you can just do at home. In this particular case, there's something called the Ragland's test for postural hypotension. And the idea is that the adrenal glands produce adrenaline that causes the constriction of the blood vessel. So these hormones constrict the abdominal veins when you stand, so there's no pooling of blood due to gravity. And therefore, you can tell by taking your blood pressure lying down and taking it standing up, if there's a change. And an excellent one would be 6 to 10 point change in systolic blood pressure upon standing. And then it would be, good if it remains the same, and poor if it drops, and failure if it drops like 10 to 20 points, and exhausted if it's more than 20 points. So that just gives you a basic idea. Then there's this other test called the paradoxical pupillary reflex test, and that's due to the sodium-potassium imbalance that's created when we start having issues requiring too much cortisol and not allowing us to make enough aldosterone. And what you do is you shine a light across the eyes, not into the eyes, and you see if your pupils dilate and how they react. And again, this picture looks a little scary, but I was just trying to point out, how the pupils look. So an excellent thing would be pupils constrict and hold tight for 20 seconds without pulsing when you apply the light, because they're strong, they're able, they constrict, they don't want a lot of light to get through. But if they start, not responding that well, and they pulse after 10 seconds, or they enlarge and then they pulse after 5 to 10 seconds, that means that maybe your adrenals aren't so healthy and your mineralocorticoids aren't so good. So it's an indication that there might be some dysfunction, and your doctor can easily do this test in the office. Your friends can do this test for you as well. So look on the internet, get the details about that, okay? The one thing that really affects the adrenal glands that I find over and over again is blood sugar dysregulation, because the body really tightly controls blood sugar. We have about 1 gallon of blood, and in that there's only about a teaspoon of sugar, so that's pretty serious. Our bodies use glycogen if they need to, if we run out, it's because it's stored sugar, and then we can use muscles and we can use our muscles and fat to generate sugar if we need to, if it runs out. So it's just really, really important in order for us to keep this stuff stable. There are some blood sugar issues that can occur, and here's the way that this usually looks. You normally have good function, and the next thing you know, you start having issues with blood sugar imbalance. Maybe you're not eating often enough. Maybe you're not eating the right amount of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. Maybe you have problems with cortisol levels because you're under stress and the body is releasing stored sugar thinking you need to run away from your boss. Can't do that, right? So eventually you start to have too much sugar in the bloodstream, and then you can start to develop something like insulin resistance. If you think about this, it's the way the mechanism of insulin resistance works. We'll talk about in just a moment. I'll go over that a little later. And then eventually with insulin resistance, we start having problems with fats. We start to store these extra sugars as fats, and then we can eventually lead to diabetes. So this is the progression of dysfunction of blood sugar issues. So how do we know if you're having some blood sugar issues? So could this be you? Do you get irritable, lightheaded, and shaky between meals? Do you feel energized after eating? Does your energy drop in the afternoon? Do you crave sweets and sugar in the afternoon? Do you wake up in the middle of the night? Do you have trouble concentrating before you eat? Do you have to depend on coffee to keep you going? Do you feel agitated, easily upset, and nervous between meals? Basically, does eating make you feel better? And again, this could happen because you wait too long between your meals, you eat too many carbohydrates, or due to stress. Or maybe this is more like you. Do you get fatigued after meals? Do you crave sugars and sweets after meals? Do you feel you need coffee or stimulants to keep you going? Is your waist size becoming larger than your hips? Are you finding that you're urinating more often? Has your thirst and appetite been increased? Do you gain weight under stress? And do you have problems falling asleep? And basically the idea is, does eating make you feel worse several hours after you eat that meal? Does food relieve a symptom, or does foods create a symptom? So we talked about insulin resistance. I said I was going to talk about why this occurs. So there's two pictures here. The top picture is a picture of a normal cell, and the bottom one is an insulin resistant cell. So let's look at the top picture in detail. You see there's red circles. That's going to indicate blood sugar, and there's blue circles that are going to indicate insulin. And then you can see over here, this is over on the right, is supposed to be a cell membrane. When the body senses sugar, it creates these openings. They're normally not there. And it does that when insulin docks onto these receptors, or onto the cells, and then these receptors come and let the sugar in. And you can see sugar in this bloodstream, insulin sitting in the receptors, and sugar inside the cell so energy can be made. Now, the picture below is quite different. You can see there's lots and lots and lots of different sugar, lots and lots of sugar occurring here. And there's lots and lots of insulin because there's lots and lots of sugar. But notice there's not a lot of openings in the cells. There's just a few openings. And that's because the cell becomes resistant to insulin. I want you to picture this. Say that pizza was the only food on the planet. So you ate pizza for every single meal. You eat it for every day. You eat it every week. You eat it every month. And you eat it every year. how quickly do you think you're going to get tired of the taste of pizza? It's no different than the cells. It realizes that, hey, this is a lot of blood sugar. If I bring this in, I'm going to cause damage to the cells. I have to be very careful about what I allow in. And notice, not only is it careful, it's over careful. And very little sugar is brought into the cells, and that's why people have problem with insulin resistance, have problems with energies as one of their symptoms. You may be having problems with sugar dysregulation. And the idea is that we don't want that. And what we can do is we can use diet to help us with that. So we have this opportunity when we eat a meal, we get a rise in blood sugar. And then once we get that rise in blood sugar, the body recognizes, hey, there's blood sugar. This is great. I'm going to bring it into the cells. I'm going to make some energy. And so 3 times a day, you get this rise in blood sugar and it's brought into the cells and everybody's happy. But if you're a person that has problems with sugar dysregulation, you might be getting these very high spikes of sugar. And then you're going to get very low spikes, corresponding spikes, because if the body sees high spikes of sugar, it's going to release a lot of insulin, and insulin tends to be a little bit overreactive, and it may end up depleting you of sugar, and then you need more and more sugar, and the cycle continues and continues and continues. But if we go ahead and we compose each meal correctly, we can go ahead and minimize those sugar responses. So let's talk about that. If we can take a high glycemic or a high sugary type of meal and turn it into a low glycemic meal, we can have better control over our blood sugar. And so what we do to make this happen is we include proteins, carbohydrates, and fats with each and every meal. The protein response is going to, the protein component will slow down the sugar response. The carbohydrates will add fiber that will slow down the sugar response. That'll also give you good vitamins and minerals, will feed the good gut bacteria as well, and that in turn will help feed the gut cells. So it's a win-win-win-win situation with carbohydrates. And then you add lots and lots of fat, and that keeps you in a mild ketogenic state, and your blood sugar stays nice and stable throughout the day. If you don't include things like proteins in the meal, you can end up depleting your stored proteins, and then you're going to end up taking those necessary proteins away, or stored amino acids, I should say, and then taking those stored amino acids away and not have enough, and the body's going to then strip your gut, and it's going to strip your things like your muscles, and it can strip things like your collagen, and you can begin to age. So it's really important to include protein with every meal. Here's the keys to eating and keeping your blood sugar nice and stable. Eat those balanced meals we just talked about. Eat at least 3 to 5 meals if you have blood sugar that goes too low. Go ahead and start a meal with good protein, and make sure that you reduce the consumption of high fructose corn syrup. Eat fiber-containing foods. Add good fats to those foods to keep the membranes nice and flexible so that sugar can go in and out easily. Stay away from excessive coffee and bad fats, and eat an all-protein snack before you go to bed. There's also some supplements that you can take for blood sugar regulation while you're working on your diet. You might want to take a multivitamin mineral, especially things like magnesium. Good essential fatty acids to keep our cell membranes nice and healthy. Magnesium glycinate, far away from calcium, so we take it at night by itself. And for some folks, they might need alpha-lipoic acid or gymnema to help them with their blood sugar regulation. Chromium, vanadium, all the minerals contained in multivitamin will be very helpful as well. We have a normal response to food. So, our fasting blood sugar and just what's rumbling around the bloodstream is usually anywhere between 85 to 100 nanograms per deciliter, and that's pretty good. Now, if you eat a meal 1 hour later, you want it to stay less than 140, and then as that sugar gets tucked into the cells, it should go down and down and down. So by 3 hours, it should go back to your baseline. So you can play around. You can get a really cheap glucometer from the drugstore or even the grocery store and play with this to see how your body responds to food. So in addition to glucose that we just talked about, there's other markers that you can utilize to see if you're having problems with blood sugar dysregulation. One of the markers indicated here is called hemoglobin A1C, and we're going to talk about that in detail in a little bit later. But what that is the average blood sugar over the last 120 days. There's another marker that I prefer over hemoglobin A1C, and that's called fasting insulin. And I like that because for the folks that are insulin resistant, there's going to be a lot of insulin sitting in the bloodstream that doesn't need to be there, and we'll be able to detect that. If the insulin marker is low, we can also see, wow, maybe there's some problem with the pancreas not producing enough insulin. So that's a very valuable marker. In addition, we know that excess sugar gets stored as blood lipids. So we'll be able to look at the lipid panel here, the cholesterol, the triglycerides, so on and so forth, to be able to get an indication if we're starting to turn that sugar into stored fat. The last marker I like to look at is something called LDH, which is an enzyme that's used in creating alternate sources of energy from stored sources. And what we do is we look at that particular enzyme and we see if it's lower than 140. And if that's the case, we tend to think that someone has a problem with something called reactive hypoglycemia, where they're having problems keeping their blood sugar stable and it becomes too low. So these are very valuable things that you can talk with your doctor. So let's just spend a moment talking about hemoglobin A1C. Now the idea is this: your blood cells live for an average of about 120 days, and the blood cells run through the bloodstream. And on these blood cells, if you can imagine little arms sticking out, and these little arms pass by sugar and hold on to them, they glycate them. So this is the idea of some of the doctors being able to test hemoglobin A1C. They're trying to see how much glycated sugar is on these blood cells. But there was a study published in 2004 in the Diabetics Journal where researchers found that the lifetime of hemoglobin cells of diabetes, those folks with diabetes, could be as little as 81 days. And in non-diabetics, they could survive up to 146 days. So what does that mean? That means that if you have blood cells that last longer than 120 days, they have more opportunity to latch onto more sugar, and therefore your hemoglobin A1C levels may be higher, might be artificially higher than what the doctors expect. And so if your hemoglobin A1C comes back at 5.8 and the doctors are looking at a threshold of 5.6, they go, hey, you're heading towards diabetes and metabolic syndrome. And it may be that you just have very resilient red blood cells. So we need to take that into account. There's other conditions that can also affect hemoglobin A1C and either raise it or lower it. And that's things like anemias may cause it to be lower than it should be. Things like nutrient deficiencies. Dr. Ron Grzanti found that zinc and B6, those with pyroluria, might have an issues with hemoglobin A1C being faulty. There's ethnicity. Those folks with sickle cell may have a problem misleading hemoglobin A1C levels, and they may be underdiagnosed as diabetics. So, hemoglobin A1C may be a great first-line tool, but please just don't rely on that value alone. Look at your signs, look at your symptoms, look at your blood sugar while you're eating. Do that test while you're eating, and definitely look at your fasting insulin, okay? So let's summarize what we're talking about. Stress is stress, no matter the source. And the ways that you can help protect your body against at least stress related to meals is to make sure you're eating balanced meals and you're eating frequently, especially if you have problems with low blood sugar. Make sure that they have proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, and please don't skip breakfast. Try to avoid coffee or other caffeine-containing beverages. Look for sources of inflammation, be it foods, be it infections, anything. Dental, whatever it is, you need to take the load off the adrenal glands. Work with your practitioner to try to find out if there's things going on with your health that may be affecting your adrenal glands. The adrenal glands love to go to sleep by 10 p.m. and they love to have a full night's sleep. If you find that you're waking up at 3 to 4 a.m., make sure you're eating a high protein snack before you go to bed to keep those blood sugars nice and stable. So either high protein, high fat, just something to keep you sustained. Make sure you stay hydrated. That's really important in a lot of the metabolic processes. And exercise, just absolutely key. You might want to consider doing things like yoga and meditation, and please do whatever it is that you love to do. Paint, dance, sing, eat out, love, whatever, and do it frequently and often. So thank you again for attending. If you'd like to find out more about functional medicine, clinical nutrition, genetics, look at our website. We've got a lot of common conditions on there, and we do talk a lot about blood sugar. We do talk about adrenals in more detail. Or if you'd like to, check out our new book. It's on Amazon. It's called Eliminating the Pain of an Elimination Diet, and it's more than just diet. It's really looking for these roadblocks. It's really looking for issues with thyroid and adrenals and blood sugars and inflammation and food intolerances and all those kinds of things. It's basically a functional medicine approach to diet and health related issues. All right. Thank you very much. Have a great evening. Good night.